Imagine this. At your son's luxurious wedding, his new wife, trying to humiliate you, pulls your chair out from under you, and you collapse to the floor as guests laugh. But before your son can reach you, another voice cuts through the tension, the voice of the bride's own mother who has just walked in, and she says for the whole room to hear, "Madam Helen, is that you?" Looking at you with reverence. First, I want to give a very special, heartfelt shout out to my wonderful and active subscribers, Christine from Los Angeles, Mary Kate from Alabama, and Joshua from the United Kingdom. Thank you for being with me. We would love to know from what corners of the world you're watching. Please let us know your city in the comments below. And now, make yourselves comfortable. My name is Helen, and at 69 years old, I have come to a quiet and certain understanding that a person's value is not measured by the clothes they wear, the car they drive, or the zip code of their house. It is measured in the quiet, often unseen currency of a life lived with purpose and with kindness. It is a lesson rooted in the deep, rich soil of community, of service, of love. A lesson my new daughter-in-law, Simone, was about to learn the hard way, on the day that should have been the happiest of her life. The months leading up to the wedding had been a slow, steady tutorial in my own irrelevance. My son, David, a good man with a kind and gentle heart, had fallen completely and utterly in love with Simone, a woman who moved through the world with the sharp, glittering confidence of a finely cut diamond. She was a rising star at a corporate law firm in downtown Atlanta, a world of sleek glass towers, ruthless ambition, and a clear, unforgiving hierarchy of status. From our very first meeting, it was made painfully clear to me that in her eyes, I was at the very bottom of that hierarchy. I was the relic from a past he needed to outgrow. The quiet, working-class mother with her modest, humble home, a stark and embarrassing contrast to the glittering, high-powered world she was determined to build for them. Our attempts to plan the wedding together were a series of gentle but firm dismissals. I remember sitting with them in their modern, minimalist apartment, my heart full of ideas I'd been saving for this day since David was a boy. David always loved the little chapel on Elm Street I'd begun, picturing the beautiful historic church where I'd been a member for 40 years. We could have the reception in the community hall next door. It has a wonderful kitchen. Simone had cut me off with a smile so sweet it was almost a weapon. "Helen, that's a lovely thought, truly," she'd said, placing a perfectly manicured hand on my own. "But we're envisioning something a bit more aspirational. The community hall is wonderful for bake sales, but this is our wedding. We want our guests to have an experience." The word aspirational was a perfectly polished stone, designed to be both smooth and incredibly heavy, a gentle way of telling me that my entire life had been insufficiently ambitious. They had chosen instead a sprawling, opulent estate on the outskirts of Atlanta, a place that rented for a sum that could have paid off my entire mortgage twice over. Every offer I made was met with the same polite, condescending stonewalling. My famous pecan pies, a tradition at every family gathering. We have a pastry chef from one of the finest restaurants in the city handling the desserts, but thank you for the thought. My offer to have my church group help with the floral arrangements. Our event planner has a very specific vision, but that's so kind of you to offer. Each interaction was a small, sharp paper cut, a reminder of my place, a lesson in the fact that my simple, homespun world had no value in the new, sophisticated life she was creating for my son. David, ever the peacekeeper, would just squeeze my hand, his eyes pleading with me to understand, to not make waves. He was a man caught between two powerful tides, the deep familiar love for his mother and the dazzling, ambitious love for his new wife. For his sake, I didn't make waves. I smiled, I nodded, and I allowed my contributions, my traditions, and my very identity to be politely and systematically erased from the blueprint of his new life. The wedding reception was the final, breathtaking chapter of this quiet campaign of irrelevance. The ballroom was a fantasy of cascading flowers, shimmering silks, and the low, melodious hum of a string quartet. The guests were a collection of Atlanta's elite, doctors, lawyers, and executives, all dressed in designer clothes, their laughter light and effortless. I felt like a small brown wren that had accidentally flown into a cage of exotic, brightly colored peacocks. My assigned table, I discovered with a heart that didn't so much sink as it plummeted, was table 19. It wasn't just in the corner of the vast ballroom, it was practically in the service corridor. I could smell the industrial soap from the kitchens and hear the faint, clattering echo of dishes being washed. It was a table populated by distant, twice-removed cousins of the bride's father and a few business associates who had clearly been invited out of sheer obligation. It was a clear, unmistakable, and deeply cruel sign of my status in this new family order, the table for the afterthoughts, the unimportant. I sat down, the beautiful, intricate floral centerpiece mocking me with its opulence. I looked at my son standing beside his glamorous bride, and a memory surfaced. Unbidden, David, aged 8, on the school playground. A bigger boy had knocked a book from my hands, and David, small for his age but fierce as a lion, had planted himself between us, his small fists clenched, shouting, "You don't be mean to my mom." Where had that fierce little protector gone? Had he been buried under the weight of expensive suits and the desperate need to please his new ambitious wife? I watched as they made their grand entrance to a swell of applause, a radiant, beautiful couple, and my heart ached with a mixture of love for my son and a deep, profound dread for his future. The first course was served. A delicate construction of seared scallops and microgreens appeared before me, a work of art on a vast white plate. My table mates, the distant relatives, and obligatory business contacts murmured their approval. They spoke a language I did not fully understand, a dialect of stock options, Caribbean timeshares, and the comparative merits of various European luxury car brands. I ate in silence, my movements small and careful, feeling as though I were being judged on my ability to properly handle the ornate, heavy silverware. I tried to catch my son's eye, to share a small secret smile with him across the vast expanse of the ballroom, but his attention was completely captivated by his new, glittering family at the head table. He was laughing, a sound I had always loved, but it sounded different here, a little too loud, a little too strained, the sound of a man performing a role he had not yet grown into. During the speeches, the subtle campaign of exclusion became a public exhibition. Simone's father, a wealthy and influential attorney, stood and spoke eloquently of his daughter's ambition, her brilliance, her impeccable taste. He then welcomed my son into their family. "We are so thrilled to welcome David into the Hayes family," he'd said, his hand resting on David's shoulder. "And we are so proud to be able to provide him with a platform, a lifestyle that a young man of his obvious talents and character so clearly deserves." The implication, so skillfully delivered, was clear to everyone in the room. David was a man being rescued from a life of mediocrity, a life that his own family, that I, could not provide. The guests applauded politely. I felt my cheeks burn with a quiet, helpless shame. I endured it all with the practiced, stoic dignity that had become my shield. I smiled when I was expected to smile. I applauded when I was expected to applaud. I was a performer in a play I had not auditioned for. My role simply to be the silent, smiling, and appropriately humble mother of the groom. The main course had been cleared, and a lull in the evening's festivities had settled over the room. It was then that I saw her approaching my table, a vision in white silk and diamonds. Simone. She moved through the room with the effortless grace of a queen, bestowing a brief smile here, a light touch on an arm there. Her progress was a royal procession, and its final destination was my dark, forgotten corner of her kingdom. "Having a good time, Helen?" she asked as she reached my table, her voice a melody of perfect, practiced politeness. Her smile, however, was as sharp and as cold as a shard of ice. Her friends at the neighboring table, a clique of equally beautiful and predatory-looking young women, were watching us, their expressions a mixture of amusement and condescending pity. I had half risen from my chair to greet her, a gesture of respect from an older woman to a new bride on her wedding day. "It's a beautiful reception, Simone," I said, my voice genuine. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she said, her eyes flicking over my simple navy dress with a look that was 1,000 tiny unspoken insults. "I'm so glad you could make it." As I began to sit back down, my body moving with the slow, careful grace of my 69 years, she did it. It was a movement so swift, so deft, so expertly executed, it could have been mistaken for an accident by anyone who was not the target of its perfect, malicious intent. With a small, elegant kick of her satin-heeled shoe, she hooked the leg of my chair and slid it, silently and smoothly, a few critical inches to the side. The support I'd been expecting was simply not there. For a terrifying, weightless moment, I was suspended in empty air, my hands flailing. And then I fell. I collapsed onto the hard, unforgiving floor with a heavy, undignified thud that seemed to echo in the sudden, shocked silence of the grand ballroom. A sharp, searing pain shot through my hip. The entire room, 150 pairs of eyes, were now fixed on me, the crumpled, ridiculous old woman on the floor. From the neighboring table, I heard it clearly, a small, cruel, irrepressible giggle from one of Simone's friends, a sound that was quickly stifled. My humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating wave that washed over me, more painful than the ache in my bones. I saw my son David, his face a mask of pure, horrified disbelief, his chair scraping loudly as he shot to his feet, but it was Simone's voice that cut through the silence first. She looked down at me, her expression one of perfect theatrical surprise. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear, a performance of innocent dismay. "Helen, are you all right? It seems you're a little unsteady on your feet." She paused, letting the silence hang for a beat before delivering the final devastating blow. "Perhaps your place is on the floor after all." The line was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, a perfect public execution of my dignity. David cried out my name, a raw, wounded sound, and he began to rush towards me from across the room. But before he could take more than a few steps, before I could even begin the humiliating process of trying to get up, another voice, a new voice, clear, powerful, and authoritative, sliced through the tense, ugly atmosphere. "Madam Helen, is that you?" Every head in the ballroom turned towards the grand entrance, and there, standing framed in the magnificent archway, was the bride's own mother, The voice that cut through the venomous, hate-filled silence of the ballroom was a melody of pure, unassailable authority. It was a woman's voice, rich, calm, and resonant with a power that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with character. Every head in the room, 150 beautifully coiffed and critically judgmental heads, turned as one towards the grand entrance. Framed in the magnificent archway, silhouetted against the lights of the hotel lobby, stood a woman who radiated an aura of such profound dignity that it seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the room. It was Dr. Lena Hayes, the bride's mother. I knew from David that she was a highly respected pediatrician, a pillar of Atlanta's philanthropic community, and, ironically, the one member of Simone's family I had been most looking forward to meeting. Her flight from a medical conference in California had been delayed, and she had, until this very moment, been absent from the day's festivities. Her expression at first was one of a weary traveler's relief at having finally arrived. But as her sharp, intelligent eyes scanned the bizarre, silent tableau before her, the entire wedding reception frozen, all eyes fixed on the back of the room, her expression shifted to one of deep confusion. And then her gaze finally found the source of the drama. It found me, a crumpled 69-year-old woman still on the floor, my simple navy dress askew, my face a mask of pain and profound humiliation. I saw the moment of recognition in her eyes, a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a widening of her gaze that was not of pity, but of pure, unadulterated shock. "Madam Helen," she said again, her voice now filled with a genuine, horrified disbelief, "is that you?" What happened next was a stunning and very public realignment of the room's power dynamic. Dr. Lena Hayes, the esteemed mother of the bride, the woman everyone in this room had been waiting for, completely and totally ignored her own daughter. She did not look at Simone, the beautiful bride in her $10,000 dress. She did not look at my son David, who was frozen halfway between his table and mine. Her entire focus, her entire being, was directed at me. She moved with the swift, purposeful grace of a doctor rushing to a patient's side, her elegant evening gown whispering against the marble floor as she closed the distance between us. The crowd of guests parted for her as if she were a ship, and they were the sea. She knelt on the floor beside me, the expensive fabric of her dress pooling around her, a gesture of such profound and immediate solidarity that it brought fresh tears to my eyes. "Madam Helen, are you all right?" she asked, her voice a low, urgent murmur meant only for me. Her hands, the skilled, gentle hands of a healer, hovered over my arm, checking for injury. "What on earth happened here?" "Lena," I whispered, my voice a hoarse, shaky thing. The shame of my situation, of being found in such a state by this woman I so deeply respected, was almost too much to bear. "I'm all right. I just fell." In that moment, my instinct was still to protect my son's new marriage, to smooth over his wife's monstrous cruelty with a polite social lie. But Dr. Hayes was a woman who had spent her life diagnosing not just illnesses, but the lies and half-truths that people tell to hide their pain. She looked from my face to her daughter, who was still standing by the table, a frozen statue of dawning, terrible guilt. Dr. Hayes's eyes narrowed, and I could see her piecing together the ugly, unspoken truth of the scene. With a strength that belied her slender frame, she helped me to my feet, her arm a firm, steady support around my waist. Once I was standing, a bit unsteady, but with my dignity slowly beginning to return, she did not lead me to my chair. Instead, she turned, her arm still around me, to face her daughter. The look she gave Simone was not one of rage. It was something far worse. It was a look of cold, clear, and utterly devastating disappointment. It was the look of a mother who was seeing her own child, the person she had raised, for the very first time, and was horrified by what she saw. "Simone," Dr. Hayes said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a quiet, lethal thing that was more menacing than any shout. "I have spent the last 8 hours on a plane flying across the entire country so as not to miss the most important day of your life. I walk into your wedding reception to find your new mother-in-law, a woman I admire more than almost anyone in this city, on the floor, and you are standing over her with a cruel and satisfied smirk on your face." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "Explain this to me. Now." "Mother, it was an accident," Simone stammered, the lie weak and unconvincing. She's a little unsteady. The chair." Dr. Hayes cut her off with a single sharp shake of her head, a gesture that clearly said, "Do not lie to me." The silence stretched for another long, terrible moment. Then Dr. Hayes turned away from her stammering, guilty daughter, a clear public dismissal. She turned her attention to the silent, watching crowd, her voice ringing out with an authority that commanded the absolute, undivided attention of every single person in the room. "I think," she said, her voice now full of a cold, righteous anger, "that you all need to know exactly who this woman is." With her arm still a firm protective anchor around my waist, Dr. Lena Hayes surveyed the silent, gaping faces of the wedding guests. She was not a tall woman, but in that moment she seemed to tower over everyone in the room. Her presence, her sheer, unshakable integrity, was a force that commanded not just attention, but a deep and profound respect. The snickering from Simone's friends had long since died, replaced by a look of wide-eyed, dawning horror. My son David stood frozen between the tables, his face a canvas of confusion and grief, and Simone, her own daughter, looked as if the marble floor had turned to quicksand beneath her feet. "Most of you in this room know who I am," Dr. Hayes began, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the vast, silent ballroom. "You know my work with the city's hospitals, with our community's charitable foundations. I have had the privilege of working alongside some of the most powerful and influential people in Atlanta." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before it came to rest, with a look of immense and genuine reverence on me. "But what you may not know," she continued, "is that the person I have always looked up to, my own personal hero in this community, the woman whose example I have tried and often failed to live up to, is the woman standing right here beside me, Madam Helen." A fresh wave of confused whispers rippled through the crowd. I felt my own face flush with the mixture of embarrassment and a strange, unfamiliar sense of pride. "Let me tell you a story," Dr. Hayes said, her voice taking on the quality of a master storyteller. 15 years ago, this city was facing a severe budget crisis. Our public services were being cut to the bone, and the first thing on the chopping block was the pediatric oncology wing at the Grady Children's Hospital. The wing that cared for the city's most vulnerable children, the ones with cancer, whose families had nowhere else to turn. The politicians gave up. The wealthy donors said the cause was lost. The hospital board was preparing to close the doors and send those sick children home. She let the bleakness of the picture settle in the minds of her wealthy, comfortable audience. "And just when all hope was lost," she continued, her voice rising with a new passion, "this woman, Helen, refused to let it happen. She was not a wealthy socialite with a famous name. She was a volunteer, a mother, a woman with no special connections, armed with nothing more than a fierce and unshakable sense of what was right. For 6 months, this woman worked 18-hour days. She organized bake sales in church basements. She went door to door in every neighborhood in this city, collecting dollars and quarters in a coffee can. She wrote hundreds of letters. She made thousands of phone calls. She rallied, she inspired, and she shamed this entire community into action. I could see it on the faces of the guests, the dawning recognition, the half-forgotten memory of a story that had once dominated the local news. She, almost single-handedly, Dr. Hayes declared, her voice now ringing with a triumphant power, through sheer force of will and the unimpeachable power of her own integrity, organized and led a grassroots campaign that did what all the money and power in this city could not. She raised over $2 million. A collective gasp went through the room. $2 million. I looked at my son. Tears were now streaming freely down his face, tears not of shame, but of a profound and sudden understanding. A wave of pride so powerful it was a form of grief for the years he had not known this story. "Ma," he whispered, the sound a raw, broken thing from across the room. "Ma, you never told me." "This woman," Dr. Hayes finished, her voice now quiet again, but imbued with a new heavy authority, "is a living legend in this city. Her name is on a plaque on the wall of the hospital wing she saved, a wing where my own goddaughter was treated and cured of leukemia. Helen doesn't wear designer clothes or drive a fancy car because she has spent her entire life pouring her resources, her time, and her very soul into the well-being of others. She finally turned her gaze to her own daughter. The passion and the warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a look of such cold, profound, and devastating disappointment that I almost felt a pang of pity for Simone. And I have just walked into my own daughter's wedding," she said, her voice a low, lethal whisper that was somehow the most damning indictment of all, "to witness this community hero being treated with a contempt so profound, so utterly without grace, that I am ashamed to call you my own." The weight of her words, of her mother's public condemnation, finally and completely broke Simone. The arrogant, confident mask shattered, and all that was left was a small, frightened, and deeply ashamed young woman. The party was over. The trial, however, had just begun, as Dr. Hayes's final damning words fell upon her daughter. The opulent ballroom was thick with a silence that was unlike any I had ever experienced. It was not just an absence of noise, it was a heavy, weighted silence, filled with the collective shame, awe, and dawning understanding of 150 souls. In that moment, I was no longer an old woman in a simple dress who had been humiliated at her son's wedding. I was a symbol, a story, a testament to a life lived with a purpose they were only now beginning to comprehend. My mind, however, was no longer in that glittering room. It had drifted back 15 years, not with a sense of pride, but with a vivid, visceral memory of the exhaustion and the desperation that had fueled the entire impossible journey. It had begun, as so many great and terrible things do, in a drab, fluorescent-lit hospital basement. I was a volunteer at the Grady Children's Hospital, a role I had taken on after my own husband passed away, seeking a purpose to fill the quiet, empty hours of my new life. My official duty was to read stories to the children in the pediatric oncology wing, a place of profound sadness and almost unbelievable bravery. It was a world of beeping machines, of the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic, and of children with eyes that were far too old for their small, frail bodies. My motivation was a deeply personal one. My own son, David, when he was just 8 years old, had spent 6 terrifying weeks in this very hospital, battling a severe case of pneumonia that had nearly taken him from me. I had never forgotten the kindness of the nurses, the steady reassurance of the doctors, the way this community had wrapped its arms around a terrified single mother. My volunteer work was my way of paying back that debt, of tending to the garden of compassion that had once saved me. I had formed a special bond with a little girl named Maya, a fierce, funny 7-year-old with a brilliant mind and a body that was being ravaged by leukemia. I would spend hours with her, our heads bent over books about dragons and distant galaxies, her laughter a small, fragile bell in the quiet, sterile room. She was the heart of my work there. The news of the budget cuts came on a rainy Tuesday. The hospital administrator, a good man with a perpetually worried face, had gathered the staff and volunteers to deliver the devastating verdict. The city was broke, and the pediatric oncology wing, with its expensive treatments and high-need patients, was being closed. The children would be transferred to other facilities, scattered to the winds, their continuity of care shattered. We all knew what it really meant. Some, like Maya, whose families had no other options, would simply fall through the cracks. It was a death sentence, delivered not by a disease, but by a budget spreadsheet. The despair in that room was a thick, choking fog. The nurses wept, the doctors raged, but in the end, they were all employees of a system that had made its decision. They were powerless. And it was in that moment of collective, resigned defeat that something inside me, something I didn't know I possessed, refused to surrender. I thought of Maya. I thought of a young, terrified David struggling for breath in a hospital bed, and I thought of the promise of community, the idea that we are all responsible for one another. I was not a wealthy woman. I was not a person with powerful connections. I was just Helen, a retired bookkeeper and a hospital volunteer. But I had a voice, and I had a story to tell. My campaign began not with a grand gesture, but with a simple, humble one, a bake sale at my church. I stayed up for 2 days straight, my small kitchen a whirlwind of flour and sugar, and I baked every pecan pie, every lemon square, every sweet potato tart my mother had ever taught me to make. We raised $742. It was a ridiculously small sum against the millions that were needed, but it was a start. It was an act of defiance. From there, the fire began to spread. I took that $700 and I used it to print 5,000 simple black and white flyers at a local copy shop. The flyers didn't just have facts and figures. They had a picture of Maya, her beautiful, smiling face, a powerful indictment of the city's cold fiscal logic. I went door to door, in every neighborhood, from the wealthiest suburbs to the poorest projects. I didn't just ask for money. I told them Maya's story. I told them my story. I was a storyteller, connecting the heart of our community to the plight of its most vulnerable children. It was slow, grinding, and often disheartening work, but for every door that was slammed in my face, another would open with a crumpled dollar bill and a word of encouragement. Slowly, a small army of volunteers began to assemble around me. Other mothers, retired teachers, church members. We were a ragtag, unlikely force, armed with nothing but coffee cans for donations and an unshakable belief in our cause. The turning point came when a young, ambitious reporter for the local Channel 2 News caught wind of our story. The small, human interest piece she did on our one-woman crusade aired on a slow Tuesday night. The next morning, my phone began to ring, and it did not stop for 6 months. The small spark I had lit had been fanned by the media into a citywide wildfire of compassion and outrage, and I, the quiet, unassuming woman who just wanted to save one little girl, had become its reluctant and utterly exhausted leader. The memory of that long, exhausting, and ultimately triumphant battle was a vivid and overwhelming thing. It faded as I felt Dr. Hayes's supportive hand squeeze my arm, a gentle pressure that pulled me from the depths of the past and back into the tense, supercharged atmosphere of the present. She was looking out at the silent, captive audience of the wedding reception, her expression one of righteous, unwavering conviction. She was about to deliver the final public chapter of the story I had just relived in the private, quiet theater of my own mind. "I want to tell you all a story," Dr. Hayes began again, her voice a calm, commanding force that effortlessly silenced the last of the confused whispers. "It's a story about the true character of this city and about the true character of the woman my daughter has so grievously insulted tonight." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. 15 years ago, as many of you may remember, Atlanta was in the midst of a severe budget crisis. Our public services were being cut to the bone, and the city's leadership was forced to make impossible choices. The first and most heartbreaking casualty of these cuts was to be the pediatric oncology wing at Grady Children's Hospital. A low murmur of recognition rippled through the older guests in the room. "It was a place of last resort for so many," Dr. Hayes continued, her voice resonating with a deep personal pain. "A place that cared for the city's most vulnerable children, the ones with cancer, whose families had no other options. The politicians had surrendered. The wealthy donors had declared the cause a lost one. The hospital board itself was preparing to close the doors and send those sick, terrified children home. All hope, it seemed, was lost." She then turned her gaze, full of a fierce and shining admiration, back to me. "And that," she declared, her voice rising with a new and powerful passion, "is when this woman, Helen, refused to let it happen. She was not a wealthy socialite with a famous name. She was not a politician with a web of powerful connections. She was a volunteer, a recently widowed woman, a mother who had once seen her own child's life saved within those very walls, who was armed with nothing more than a coffee can for donations and a fierce, unshakable sense of what was right. I saw my son David take a sharp, involuntary breath, his eyes fixed on me, a look of dawning, shocked comprehension on his face. When the men in suits in City Hall had given up, Dr. Hayes said, her words a clear and damning indictment of the city's powerful elite, many of whom were in that very room, this woman, in a simple church basement, refused to. She worked 18-hour days for 6 months straight. She wore out 2 pairs of her most sensible shoes going door to door in every neighborhood in this city. She didn't just ask people for money. She told them the story of a little girl named Maya, a 7-year-old with leukemia who had become the face of our city's failure. She rallied, she inspired, and she shamed this entire community into action. The story, my story, was being told, and hearing it from the mouth of this powerful, eloquent woman, I almost didn't recognize myself. She was describing a hero, a legend. I just remembered the exhaustion, the fear, and the constant grinding work. And in those 6 months, Dr. Hayes announced, her voice ringing with a triumphant final authority, this mother with no special connections, this woman of simple means, did what no one in this city thought was possible. She raised over $2 million. She almost single-handedly saved that hospital wing. A collective audible gasp went through the room. The guests were no longer just watching a scene of family drama. They were witnessing the unveiling of a local legend. Her name, Dr. Hayes continued, her voice softening but losing none of its power, is on a small bronze plaque on the wall of that wing. A wall in a building where children are alive today, breathing, laughing, and growing up because of her. A wing, she added, her voice now thick with a sudden raw emotion, where my own goddaughter was treated and cured of her leukemia 5 years ago. So when I call this woman a hero, I do not speak lightly. The room was utterly, completely silent. I looked at my son. Tears were now streaming freely and unashamedly down his face, tears of pride, of shock, and of a profound, heartbreaking regret for the years he had not known the true measure of his own mother. "Ma," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken sound that was just for me, though it seemed to echo in the vast, silent space. "Ma, you never told me." I could only shake my head, my own eyes now blurry with tears. Dr. Hayes finally turned her gaze back to her own daughter. The warmth, the passion, the admiration in her eyes vanished, replaced by a look of such cold, profound, and devastating disappointment that it felt like the temperature in the room had dropped by 20 degrees. "And I have just walked into my own daughter's wedding," she said, her voice now a low, lethal whisper that was somehow the most damning indictment of all. "To witness this community hero, this woman to whom my own family owes an unpayable debt, being treated with a contempt so profound, so utterly without grace, that I am ashamed. I am ashamed to call you my own." The silence in the ballroom following Dr. Hayes' speech was a living, breathing entity. It was a silence so profound, so heavy, with the weight of her words that it seemed to press down on us all, a physical force that made it difficult to breathe. In that moment, the opulent room, with its glittering chandeliers and extravagant floral displays, was no longer a place of celebration. It was a courtroom, and a public judgment had just been rendered. My daughter-in-law, Simone, the radiant, confident bride, was the defendant, and she had been found guilty by the one person whose verdict she could not appeal, her own mother. I watched her, and for the first time I saw past the sharp, brittle armor of her ambition and her condescension. I saw the small, insecure, and now utterly terrified young woman cowering beneath it. Her face, which had been a mask of pale shock, now began to crumble. Her perfectly painted lips trembled, and her eyes, which had been wide with horror, now filled with the hot, shameful tears of a child who has been caught in a terrible, unforgivable act. The friends she had been trying so desperately to impress, the clique of sharp-tongued young women at the neighboring table, were now looking anywhere but at her, their expressions a mixture of pity and a desperate social desire to distance themselves from her catastrophic fall from grace. Her father's face was a mask of grim parental shame. And my son, David, her new husband, was not even looking at her. His gaze was still fixed on me, his eyes filled with a universe of love, of pride, and of a profound, heartbreaking regret that he was only now learning the true story of his own mother. In that moment, Simone was completely and utterly alone, isolated on a desolate island of her own making. She could have run. She could have fled the ballroom, fled the public execution of her character, and hidden from the 150 pairs of eyes that were now fixed upon her, waiting for her response. But she did something else. Something that, in its own way, was the bravest and most difficult thing she had ever done in her life. She moved. Her first step was hesitant, a clumsy, stumbling motion that was a universe away from the confident, gliding grace with which she had entered the room just hours before. She began to walk, not towards the exit, but towards the small elevated stage at the front of the room where the band had been playing, and where a single lonely microphone stood on its stand. It was the longest, most agonizing walk of her life. Every eye in the room followed her, their gazes a physical weight. Her $10,000 wedding dress, which had once been a symbol of her triumph, now seemed like a costume of shame, its long train dragging behind her on the floor like a heavy silken chain. When she reached the stage, her hands were trembling so badly she could barely grasp the microphone. She brought it to her lips, and the soft, electronic hum of the speakers filled the silent room. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "What I did tonight," she began, her voice a raw, broken whisper that was a fragile human thing. "What I did to Helen. It was unforgivable." The words were a simple, unadorned confession, a plea of guilty to the silent, watching jury. She paused, struggling to find the words, to explain the ugliness that had led her to this moment. "I have spent my entire life," she continued, her voice gaining a small, trembling measure of strength, "feeling like I wasn't quite good enough, feeling like I had to live up to the impossible, brilliant example set by my mother. She is a woman of such profound character and integrity, and I am not. Instead of trying to learn from her to become a better person," she confessed, her words a raw, honest, and deeply painful act of self-excavation, "I became a snob. I became cruel. I thought that by building a world of expensive, perfect things, I could somehow make myself feel valuable. I thought that by pushing other people down, especially someone as genuinely good and kind and humble as Helen, I could somehow lift myself up. I was wrong. It was a lie I told myself, and it was a lie that was born from my own weakness, from my own insecurity, from my own pathetic, ugly pride." She finally turned from the faceless crowd and looked directly at me across the vast, silent expanse of the ballroom. Her eyes were pleading, her face a mess of tears. This was no longer a public performance. This was a direct, personal, and utterly desperate appeal. "Helen," she said, my name a choked, sorrowful sound on her lips, "I am so sorry. I was threatened by your quiet dignity. I was shamed by your simple, powerful goodness, and so I tried to destroy it. I tried to humiliate you to make myself feel big. It was a monstrous, unforgivable thing to do. Please, if you can ever find it in your heart, please give me a chance to become the kind of woman who is worthy of being a part of your family. Please." Simone's final pleading words hung in the vast, silent ballroom, a fragile and desperate prayer. Every eye in the room, which had moments before been fixed on me with a mixture of pity and awe, now turned to me with a new and urgent question. What would the wronged woman do? What would this quiet, humble, and secretly heroic figure do in the face of this raw, public, and seemingly heartfelt apology? I could feel the weight of their collective expectation, the silent anticipation of 150 souls waiting for my verdict. I looked at Simone, this beautiful, broken young woman, standing on a stage under the hot, unforgiving lights, her expensive wedding dress now a costume of her own self-inflicted shame. I saw the genuine, gut-wrenching remorse in her tear-streaked face, and in that moment, the last vestiges of my own anger, the deep, personal wound of my humiliation, simply dissolved. I did not see the cruel, condescending snob who had tried to break me. I saw a child, a lost, insecure, and deeply unhappy child who had used cruelty as a shield because she did not know how to handle her own feelings of inadequacy. I saw a young woman who had just committed an act of profound and public self-immolation, and my heart, the heart of a mother, ached not with a sense of triumph, but with a sudden, overwhelming wave of compassion. And so, I began my own long walk. I moved from my dark, forgotten corner at the back of the room, my simple navy dress, a stark contrast to the glittering finery of the guests who parted to let me pass. My journey across the ballroom was the mirror image of hers. She had walked to the stage in shame to confess her brokenness. I was now walking toward her in grace to offer a path to wholeness. With every step, I could feel the narrative of the evening shifting again, moving from a story of judgment to a story of potential redemption. When I reached the stage, I did not ascend it. I simply stood at the bottom, looking up at her, forcing her to look down at me. It was a small final rebalancing of the power dynamic, a quiet insistence that we meet as equals. She flinched under my gaze, expecting a final quiet condemnation. I reached up and took her trembling hand in my own. Her skin was as cold as ice. "It takes a very strong person," I began, my voice soft, but carrying easily through the silent, microphone-amplified room, to stand up in front of the world and admit they were wrong. It takes a kind of courage that most people much older and supposedly wiser than you, never find in their entire lives. I squeezed her hand gently. "What you did to me tonight was cruel, Simone. It was born from a place of pain and insecurity, and it was wrong. But what you are doing right now," I said, looking around at the captive audience, "this act of raw, painful public honesty, this is an act of profound strength, and it is an act of character." I saw a flicker of disbelief, of dawning, tearful hope in her eyes. "Your mother is right," I continued. "I am not a person of great wealth or status. The only thing of true value I have ever built in my life is my family. A family I had hoped you would be a part of." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And a family," I finished, my voice full of a simple, quiet, and absolute truth, "is built not on perfection, but on forgiveness." I gave her a small, genuine smile. "Welcome to the family, my dear." A sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her lips. She practically fell down the small steps of the stage and into my arms. We stood there in the center of the dance floor, two women from different worlds, clinging to each other in a hug that was awkward and messy and profoundly, beautifully real. It was a hug of forgiveness, a hug that was the beginning of our own personal healing. From the corner of my eye, I saw my son David approaching. He wrapped his strong arms around both of us, his own tears of relief and love now falling freely. "Oh, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." And then Dr. Hayes was there as well, her hand on her daughter's back, her own eyes shining with a fierce, proud, and grateful light. We stood together, a strange, unlikely, and newly forged family, united not by a flawless, perfect celebration, but by a moment of profound human brokenness and the even more profound grace of a second chance. As the four of us stood there, a small solid island, in the center of the vast ballroom, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that the $100,000 wedding reception, the perfect flowers, the expensive food, the string quartet, all of it, had been a sham, a beautiful, empty performance. This moment, this raw, painful, honest, and ultimately forgiving moment, this was the true beginning of my son's marriage. This was the real wedding. And it was built not on a foundation of wealth or status, but on the much stronger, much more resilient, and much more beautiful ground of humility, of honesty, and of grace. The band, sensing the shift in the room, began to play a soft, gentle melody, and the quiet, watching guests finally, tentatively, began to applaud. The applause that filled the grand ballroom was a soft, warm, and gentle thing. It was not the polite, perfunctory applause from the earlier speeches. This was a sound of profound emotional relief, a collective exhalation from 150 guests who had been unwitting witnesses to the near-death and sudden miraculous rebirth of a family. They were applauding not just my act of forgiveness, but Simone's act of courage and the fragile, beautiful, and hard-won grace of a second chance. We stood on the stage for a moment, a strange and unlikely tableau of 4 people bound together by the raw, messy, and ultimately healing power of the truth. Simone was still weeping, but her sobs were no longer the ragged, shameful gasps of a disgraced bride. They were the cleansing, cathartic tears of a woman who had been set free from the prison of her own pride. My son David held both of us, his own tears of relief and love a silent testament to the profound shift that had just occurred in his world. And Dr. Hayes, her hand resting on her daughter's back, looked at me with an expression of such deep and profound gratitude that it felt like a blessing. It was she who finally took charge, her practical physician's nature reasserting itself. "All right," she said, her voice a low, calming murmur amidst the emotional storm. "I think we could all use a moment. There is a small sitting room just off the main hall. Let's go in there and catch our breath." She led us away from the watching eyes of the guests, away from the stage and the microphone that had served as both a weapon of humiliation and an instrument of redemption. The small anteroom was a quiet, dimly lit sanctuary of plush sofas and antique furniture. The moment the heavy oak door closed behind us, sealing us off from the noise of the reception, the full, staggering weight of the evening seemed to descend upon my son. He turned to me, his face a wreck of love and a newfound agonizing regret. "Mom," he began, his voice choked with an emotion so deep it was almost painful to witness. "The hospital, the $2 million. Why did you never tell me any of it?" I looked at my son, at this good, kind man who I loved more than life itself, and I saw in his eyes the painful realization that he did not truly know his own mother. "Oh, David," I said softly, reaching out to touch his cheek. "It wasn't a secret, honey. It wasn't your story to carry. It was a long time ago. It was just something that needed to be done, and I had the time and the energy to do it. I never thought of it as some grand, heroic act to be memorialized." Simone, who had been sitting silently on the sofa, her face buried in her hands, looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and full of a new dawning awe. "But it was, Helen," she whispered. "It was a heroic act, and I treated you like you were nothing. You treated me like the woman you thought I was," I corrected her gently. "A simple, quiet woman with a simple, quiet life, and there is no shame in that. That is who I am. The other part, the fundraising, that was just a small chapter in a long book." "Tell us," David pleaded, his voice full of a desperate, boyish need to understand, to know the part of his own mother's history that had been a secret to him for so long. "Please, Mom, tell us the whole story." And so, in the quiet, dimly lit sanctuary of that small room, I did. I told them a story they had never heard, a story of a time 15 years ago, when my heart had been as broken as theirs were now. I told them about the Grady Children's Hospital, about the pediatric oncology wing that had become my second home after their grandfather passed away. I told them about a fierce, funny 7-year-old girl named Maya who had eyes as bright as stars and a laugh that could make the most hardened heart melt. I told them how she had been fighting leukemia with a courage that put grown men to shame and how I had come to love her as if she were my own. I told them about the devastating news of the budget cuts, of the wing's imminent closure, a death sentence delivered by a city spreadsheet, and I told them of the moment I had stood in that sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital basement and had made a silent, impossible promise to that little girl that I would not let her, and the other children like her, be forgotten. I told them about the beginning of the campaign, about the absurdity of trying to fight a multi-million-dollar budget deficit with a batch of pecan pies from a church bake sale. I told them about the exhaustion, about the months of 18-hour days, of wearing out my shoes, going door to door with a coffee can, of being a constant, relentless, and often annoying presence at every community meeting, every town hall, every public event. I told them of the countless doors slammed in my face, of the condescending smiles, of the moments of profound despair when I was sure the cause was lost. And then I told them of the magic of a community remembering its own heart. The way a small story on the local news had turned my one-woman crusade into a citywide movement. The way volunteers had appeared as if from nowhere to help me. The way the small, crumpled dollar bills in my coffee can had slowly, miraculously, grown into a flood of compassion that had, in the end, saved a hospital and the children within it. As I finished my story, the room was silent. The only sound the soft, gentle sobs of my son and my new daughter-in-law. I had not told the story with pride. I had told it as a simple testament to the power of a community, to the idea that one small, determined person can, in fact, make a difference. When I finished my story, the small, quiet anteroom was filled with a profound and healing silence. The story of the hospital, a chapter of my life I had long considered a private and finished thing, had been brought out into the light, and its telling had become a bridge between us. Simone was looking at me, no longer with the guarded, judgmental eyes of a stranger, but with a look of such raw, unadulterated awe that it was almost painful to see. She was finally seeing the woman her own mother had looked up to for years, the woman who had been hidden in plain sight all along. David, my son, simply reached out and took my hand, his grip full of a lifetime of unspoken love and a new profound understanding. It was Dr. Hayes who finally broke the spell, her voice a gentle anchor in our sea of emotion. "Well," she said, a small proud smile on her face, "the wedding isn't over yet. And I believe you have a room full of guests who are now very eager to properly congratulate the entire family." Walking back into that grand ballroom was like entering a different world than the one I had left. The atmosphere, which had been thick with a tense, gossipy energy, was now something else entirely. The whispers were gone, replaced by a quiet, respectful deference. As we made our way back to the head table, a place I had not been invited to before, but to which Simone now guided me with a gentle, insistent hand on my arm, people would catch my eye and offer small, sincere smiles or nods of profound respect. A few of the older guests, prominent members of the Atlanta community who now clearly remembered the story, even stood as I passed. It was a strange and deeply humbling experience. We had just settled at the table when the band leader, a man who had clearly been given new instructions, announced it was time for the mother-son dance. David turned to me, his eyes still shining with unshed tears. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "may I have this dance?" He led me to the center of the vast empty dance floor. As the band began to play a soft, slow melody, he took me in his arms and we began to dance. It was a moment I had dreamed of since he was a little boy, and it was more profound than I could have ever imagined. "Mom, I am so proud of you," he whispered, his cheek against my hair, "and I am so deeply sorry. I'm sorry I never knew. I'm sorry I let Simone. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you, that I didn't see what was happening. Oh, my dear, sweet boy," I murmured, my heart overflowing. "You are a good man with a good heart. You were caught between two worlds, and you were trying to keep the peace. What matters is that you found your way back to what is true and right. That's all a mother can ever ask for." We danced in a comfortable silence for a while, our steps a slow, healing rhythm. As the song came to an end, a hesitant figure approached us. It was Simone. Her face was scrubbed clean of her earlier perfect makeup. Her eyes were still red-rimmed, but her expression was clear and open, stripped of all its previous artifice. "Helen," she began, her voice small but steady. "David, may I cut in?" David looked at me, and I gave him a small encouraging nod. He kissed my cheek, squeezed Simone's hand, and stepped away, leaving the two of us alone in the center of the room. Simone took my hands in hers, and we began to move awkwardly to the music, two former adversaries learning the first clumsy steps of a new dance. "Thank you, Helen," she whispered, her gaze fixed on our hands. "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to." "Everyone deserves a second chance, my dear," I said softly. "It's what we do with it that defines us." Later that evening, I sat at the head table, a respected guest of honor in a place where I'd once been an outcast, and I watched them. I watched as David and Simone danced together, their movements now easy and joyful. I watched as Dr. Hayes laughed with her new son-in-law. I saw a family that had been shattered by pride and insecurity being carefully, painstakingly, and beautifully put back together. I had come to this wedding feeling like a ghost, a relic of a past that was being discarded. I had been made to feel small and poor and insignificant. But as I looked out at the celebration, at the new, more honest life my son was beginning, I knew that I was the wealthiest person in the room. My wealth was not in a bank account, but in the lessons of a long life. It was in the quiet dignity of my own history. It was in the profound, boundless love I had for my son. And it was in the surprising, resilient, and deeply hopeful discovery that even a heart broken by humiliation can be mended by the simple, powerful, and priceless grace of forgiveness.